Thank you for clicking in this video. What if the place you called home held secrets far darker than you ever imagined? Two friends stumble upon a hidden door, but what lies beyond is more than just a room. It's a gateway to something much more sinister. Will they survive the horrors within, or will they be trapped in a nightmare from which there is no escape? Stay until the end to uncover the chilling truth.
I should have known better when I signed the lease. The apartment was old, really old. The kind of old that wears history like a shroud, hiding secrets in its creaking floorboards and peeling wallpaper. But as a broke university student desperate for a cheap place to stay, I didn't have much of a choice. The landlord was an elderly man with a hunched back and watery blue eyes that seemed to peer right through me. He handed me the key with a shaky hand, his grip lingering just a moment too long. "It's a quiet building," he muttered, almost as if he were trying to convince himself. "No one to bother you." The apartment itself was modest, a single bedroom with a small kitchen and a living area that barely fit the worn-out sofa that came with the place. But it was the bedroom that caught my attention, or rather, what was under it. The floor was uneven, with a slight slope leading toward one corner of the room, where the wooden boards seemed to sit a little higher than the rest. It was almost as if something was pushing up from underneath. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was an old building. Floors creak, walls settle, and drafts make the windows rattle. That's just how it is with places like this, I told myself. And yet, there was something unsettling about that room. It wasn't just the slope in the floor or the way the light from the street lamp outside cast long, jagged shadows on the walls. It was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The first few nights were uneventful. I unpacked my things, settled into a routine of late-night study sessions, and got used to the distant hum of the city outside my window. But the feeling of unease in the bedroom persisted. I found myself avoiding it as much as possible, preferring to sleep on the couch in the living room instead. It wasn't until the third night that I heard the noises. It started as a faint scratching sound, like something small was trapped inside the walls, desperate to get out. I dismissed it as rats or maybe even a stray cat that had somehow found its way into the building. But then the scratching grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like nails dragging across wood, echoing through the apartment in the dead of night. I tried to ignore it, turning up the volume on my headphones to drown out the noise. But even through the music, I could still hear it, a relentless, grating sound that set my teeth on edge. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence filled the apartment, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. That was the first time I felt it, the presence. It was as if someone, or something, was watching me. I could feel its eyes on me, tracking my every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. My heart pounded in my chest, my skin prickling with cold sweat as I scanned the room, half expecting to see a shadow lurking in the corner. But there was nothing. Just the dark, empty room and the quiet hum of the city outside. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And as I lay there, staring up at the cracked ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't going to leave me alone. Not until it got what it wanted. I awoke the next morning feeling uneasy, the events of the previous night still fresh in my mind. The apartment was silent, bathed in the gray light of early dawn. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a dream, a product of stress and too many late-night study sessions. But the unease in my gut told me otherwise. The day passed in a blur of classes and coffee-fueled study sessions at the university library. I tried to focus on my assignments, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the apartment, to the strange noises, and that unsettling presence that had made itself known. By the time I returned home, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city. I hesitated at the front door, my hand hovering over the doorknob as a sense of dread washed over me. I almost turned around and left, but where would I go? I was stuck in this lease, stuck in this apartment, and whatever was inside it. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the cold. The temperature had dropped noticeably, the kind of bone-chilling cold that seeped into your skin and made your breath come out in frosty puffs. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me as I made my way to the living room. The heater was on, but it did little to dispel the cold that clung to the walls like a living thing. I didn't want to go into the bedroom, didn't want to face that strange, uneven floor and the shadows that seemed to stretch out from the corners. But I needed my textbooks, and they were all in there. I steeled myself, pushing open the door with a trembling hand. The room was as I'd left it, but there was something different about the air. It felt thicker, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of what had disturbed me the night before. And then I heard it, a faint whispering sound, so soft it was almost imperceptible. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I strained to hear where it was coming from. It seemed to be all around me, a low, insistent murmur that sent shivers down my spine. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no draft, no open window. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though I still couldn't make out any words. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking, their voices mingling in a cacophony of unintelligible sounds. Panic began to set in. I backed away, my eyes darting around the room, searching for the source of the noise. My gaze fell on the corner where the floor was uneven, and my stomach dropped. The whispers seemed to be coming from there, growing louder with each passing second. I didn't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was desperation, but I found myself walking toward the corner, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers intensified, becoming a maddening chorus that filled my head, drowning out all other thoughts. I dropped to my knees, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch the floorboards. The wood was cold under my fingers, and for a moment, I hesitated. But then I felt it, a faint vibration, as if something was moving beneath the floor, pushing against the boards from below. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed my ear to the floor, straining to hear what was beneath. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and I could feel the vibration growing stronger. It was then that I noticed a small, almost imperceptible gap between the floorboards. My fingers found the edge of one of the boards, and with a surge of adrenaline, I began to pry it loose. The wood creaked and groaned, resisting my efforts, but eventually, it gave way, revealing a dark, narrow space beneath the floor. A foul, musty odor wafted up from the opening, and I gagged, recoiling from the stench. But I couldn't look away. There was something down there, something hidden in the darkness. And whatever it was calling to me. I grabbed my phone, using the flashlight to peer into the space below. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating a small, dusty chamber. And there, in the center of it, was something that made my blood run cold. A door. A small, wooden door, barely large enough for a person to crawl through. It was painted a deep, crimson red, its surface marred by scratches and strange symbols that I couldn't decipher. The whispers were louder now, a frenzied chorus that seemed to be coming from beyond the door. My hands shook as I reached out to touch it, my fingers brushing against the rough, splintered wood. I should have stopped. I should have sealed the floorboards back up and left the apartment that very night. But I didn't. Instead, I did the one thing I would come to regret more than anything else in my life. I opened the door. The moment I opened the door, the whispers ceased, plunging the room into an eerie silence. I was left alone with the deafening sound of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears as I stared into the dark passage below. The cold air that drifted up from the hidden chamber sent shivers down my spine, but something deeper within me, a morbid curiosity or perhaps a desperate need to understand, compelled me to crawl inside. The space beneath the floor was cramped, forcing me to drag myself forward on my elbows. Dust filled the air, coating my clothes and clinging to my skin as I inched closer to the red door. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But I was already in too deep. I needed to know what was hidden behind that door, why it was there, and what it meant. As I reached the door, I noticed that the strange symbols carved into the wood were more intricate up close. They were a mix of runes and shapes that seemed to shift and change when I looked at them, twisting in ways that defied logic. My fingers traced the grooves, and I felt a strange warmth emanating from the wood, as if the door itself was alive. My breath caught as I hesitated, my hand hovering over the small, rusted latch. The air around me felt thick, heavy with anticipation, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. Finally, with a deep breath, I unlatched the door and pulled it open. The passage beyond was narrow and lined with crumbling bricks, the smell of damp earth and decay wafting up to meet me. I shone my phone's flashlight into the darkness, revealing a steep, winding staircase descending into the depths below. The steps were old and uneven, worn smooth by the passage of time, and the walls were slick with moisture. For a moment, I considered turning back, but the pull of the unknown was too strong. With a final glance back at the small, dusty chamber, I began my descent. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step echoing in the narrow passageway. The further I went, the colder it became, until I could see my breath in front of me, a thin mist in the dim light. The walls seemed to close in around me, pressing against my shoulders as I descended deeper and deeper into the earth. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I found myself standing in a small, circular room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with jars and bottles of various sizes, their contents obscured by the thick layers of dust that coated them. In the center of the room was a large, circular stone slab, its surface etched with the same symbols that adorned the door. A heavy, oppressive silence hung in the air, broken only by the soft dripping of water from the ceiling. I stepped forward, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. There was something unsettlingly familiar about this place, as if I had seen it before in a dream or a nightmare. I approached the stone slab, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers made contact with the cold stone, a shiver ran down my spine, and the room seemed to darken, the shadows creeping closer, pressing in around me. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, barely audible but unmistakable. It reverberated through the room, sending a wave of fear crashing over me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the room, but there was nothing there. The growl came again, louder this time, seeming to come from all directions at once. Panic gripped me as I realized I was no longer alone. Something was down here with me, something unseen and malevolent. I backed away from the stone slab, my heart racing as I frantically searched for an escape. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the growling stopped. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating. But I knew better than to believe it was over. Whatever was down here, whatever I had awakened, was still with me, watching, waiting. My eyes fell on the shelves lining the walls, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. One of the jars, larger than the rest, seemed to be glowing faintly, a soft, pulsating light emanating from within. I hesitated for only a moment before I reached out and lifted the jar from the shelf. Inside was a small, red gemstone, its surface smooth and polished, and glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. As I held it up to the light, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, as if the very air around me had become poisoned. The gemstone was warm to the touch, almost burning, and I quickly set it down on the stone slab. The moment it touched the surface, the symbols etched into the stone began to glow, pulsing in time with the light from the gemstone. The ground beneath me trembled, and the walls seemed to close in even further. I knew then that I had made a terrible mistake. Whatever this place was, whatever ritual had been performed here, it was not meant to be disturbed. And now, I had set something in motion, something dark, something ancient, something that could not be stopped. And as the room filled with a low, ominous hum, I realized that the worst was yet to come. The ominous hum filled the chamber, reverberating through the walls and deep into my bones. The red gemstone pulsed with an intense, almost hypnotic light, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I stood frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the glowing symbols on the stone slab, each pulse of light syncing perfectly with the pounding of my heart. It was as though the room itself had come alive, feeding off the fear that radiated from me. The air grew thicker, more oppressive, and with each passing second, the sense of dread that had taken root in my chest deepened. I knew I needed to leave, escape this place before whatever I had awakened could fully manifest. But my feet felt glued to the floor, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I had unleashed. Suddenly, the hum shifted, becoming a low, rhythmic chant. It was a voice, no, voices, speaking in unison, their words incomprehensible yet laden with malice. They filled the chamber, echoing off the walls and burrowing into my mind, twisting my thoughts into a chaotic whirlpool of fear and confusion. Instinctively, I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The voices were inside my head now, whispering in a language I couldn't understand, but the intent was clear. They were angry, vengeful, and they wanted something from me, something I couldn't give. The red gemstone suddenly flared with a blinding light, forcing me to shield my eyes. The chanting grew louder, more urgent, as if whatever force resided within the stone was trying to break free. I staggered back, nearly tripping over my own feet, my eyes darting around the room in a desperate search for an exit. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light dimmed, and the chanting stopped. Silence descended upon the chamber once more, thick and suffocating. I cautiously lowered my hands, blinking away the spots that danced in my vision. The gemstone now lay dark and inert on the stone slab, the glow that had filled the room moments before completely gone. The symbols etched into the slab had also faded, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their earlier brilliance. For a brief, foolish moment, I thought it might be over. But then the temperature in the room plummeted, and I saw it, the faint outline of a figure, standing at the edge of the shadows. It was barely more than a wisp of smoke, an indistinct shape that wavered and shifted in the dim light. But there was no mistaking the malevolent energy that radiated from it, a dark presence that sent icy tendrils of fear snaking through my veins. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its form solidifying with each step it took toward me. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the shadows that clung to it like a second skin. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice had abandoned me, and my legs refused to obey. As it drew closer, I could make out more details. Its face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, as though it were savoring my fear, feeding off my terror. The air around it seemed to ripple, distorting the space as it moved. The figure stopped a few feet in front of me, its hollow gaze locked onto mine. The sense of dread was overwhelming, crushing me under its weight, but I couldn't look away. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, it spoke. "You should not have come here." The words echoed in my mind, carrying with them a wave of cold that seeped into my very soul. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath as the weight of the entity's presence bore down on me. It was as if the very air had turned to ice, freezing me from the inside out. I don't know how long I lay there, shivering and helpless, as the figure loomed over me. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each second an eternity. The chanting began again, low and insistent, growing louder with each passing moment. I could feel it vibrating through the floor, through my body, as if the very walls were singing the incantation. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take any more, the figure spoke again. "Return what was taken." The words were a command, laced with fury and something else, desperation, perhaps. I had no idea what it meant, but the force behind the command was undeniable. Whatever had been disturbed, whatever ritual had gone wrong, it demanded reparation. Desperation clawed at me as I tried to understand. Return what? The gemstone? But it was right there, on the slab. Or was it something else, something deeper that had been torn from this place long ago? The figure began to fade, its form dissolving back into the shadows. But its presence lingered, a cold, oppressive force that refused to leave. The chanting grew fainter, until it was barely more than a murmur in the back of my mind. And then, the room was silent once more. I struggled to my feet, my entire body trembling with fear and exhaustion. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what had happened. But the more I thought about it, the more the dread grew, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I knew one thing for certain: I had to leave this place. Whatever had been awakened, whatever force still lingered here, it was far beyond my understanding. And I was certain that if I stayed, it would consume me. But even as I turned to flee, a terrible realization dawned on me. The door at the top of the stairs was no longer there. The walls seemed to close in around me as I stood in the room, staring at the blank wall where the door had once been. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, each one growing more frantic as the reality of my situation sank in. There was no escape, no way out of this nightmare. I pressed my hands against the wall, desperately searching for some hidden latch, some trick that would bring the door back. But the cold stone was unyielding, offering no clues, no hope. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the harder I tried to think, the more the fear took hold, choking off any rational thought. The room felt alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy that seemed to seep into my very bones. The shadows crept closer, thickening around me, and I could feel their cold, suffocating presence. A low hum filled the air, a vibration that resonated deep within me, setting every nerve on edge. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave, crashing over any last shred of composure I had left. My vision blurred, the room spinning as the overwhelming terror took hold. My legs buckled, and I fell to the floor, my hands clawing at the stone as if I could somehow dig my way out of this madness. And then, everything went black. When I awoke, I was lying on the floor of my apartment, the familiar surroundings coming into focus as my eyes adjusted to the dim light. My heart still pounded in my chest, my body drenched in cold sweat. I lay there for a moment, disoriented, trying to piece together what had just happened. Was it all a dream? A vivid, horrifying nightmare? But as I sat up, the memories of the Red Room and the terror I had felt flooded back with a clarity that nightmares never have. It had been real, too real. But how had I gotten back here? I couldn't remember leaving the room, couldn't recall anything after the walls had closed in on me. The last thing I remembered was the suffocating darkness and the overwhelming fear. I rubbed my temples, trying to push away the confusion, but the feeling that something was terribly wrong gnawed at me. The apartment felt different somehow, as if it was holding on to the remnants of that other place, the Red Room. The air was heavy, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, more menacing. I was pulled from my thoughts by a knock at the door. I hesitated, the sound startling in the otherwise silent apartment. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but the knock came again, more insistent this time. I forced myself to stand, still shaky on my feet, and made my way to the door. When I opened it, I found the building's superintendent standing there, a concerned look on his face. He was the same man who had given me the keys to the apartment when I first moved in. His expression was neutral, but there was something in his eyes, an unease that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Just wanted to check in on you," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of something I couldn't quite place. "Is everything okay?" I stared at him, my mind racing. How much did he know? Had he seen something? Was he aware of what was happening in this building? The questions tumbled through my mind, but I forced myself to stay composed. "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Just had a rough night, I guess." The superintendent nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. "This place can do that to you," he said, almost as if he was speaking from experience. "It's an old building. Has a lot of history. Sometimes, that history can feel a little too close." There was something in his tone, a hint that he knew more than he was letting on. I wanted to press him, to ask him what he meant, but something held me back. A part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answers. "Right," I said, forcing a smile. "Just need to get some rest, I think." He nodded again, but the concern in his eyes didn't fade. "If you need anything, you know where to find me," he said before turning and walking down the hall. I closed the door and leaned against it, my mind racing. The superintendent knew something, I was sure of it. But what? And why wasn't he saying anything? The unease I felt only grew stronger as I thought about our conversation. Just as I was about to sink deeper into my thoughts, my phone rang, the sudden noise jolting me out of my reverie. I grabbed it from the counter, seeing the name of a friend from university on the screen, Rachel. My heart skipped a beat. Rachel and I had always been close, though I had never worked up the courage to tell her how I really felt about her. She was the one person I trusted more than anyone, the one person who might believe me if I told her what had happened. "Hey," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, you," she replied, her voice warm and familiar. "Just checking in on you. You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. I wanted to tell her everything, to unburden myself of the fear and confusion that had taken root in my mind. But where to start? "Actually, do you want to grab a coffee?" I asked, my voice tentative. "There's something I need to talk to you about." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before she replied. "Of course. I'll meet you at the usual spot in an hour." "Yeah, that sounds good," I said, relief washing over me. Maybe, just maybe, talking to Rachel would help make sense of all this. As I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare was far from over. But for now, I had to focus on getting out of this apartment and finding some semblance of normalcy, if that was even possible anymore. Sitting across from Rachel at our favorite coffee shop, I felt an odd mixture of relief and dread. The warm hum of conversation around us, the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee, these were comforting, grounding me in reality. but the memories of the red room still clung to me, dark and suffocating, refusing to be dismissed as mere nightmares. Rachel stirred her coffee absently, her eyes fixed on me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. I took a deep breath, deciding there was no better time to spill everything. I had a weird experience, I began, my voice low, as if speaking too loudly would give power to the things I was about to reveal. In my apartment. It started with strange noises, but then I found a hidden door. It led to a room painted entirely red. There was something wrong about it, Rachel. I can't even explain it. Rachel leaned forward, her expression serious. What happened in that room? I hesitated, feeling the weight of the memories pressing down on me. There was something there. I don't know what, but I felt it. It was like the room was alive, feeding off my fear. I couldn't escape, and I don't even remember how I got back to my apartment. One minute I was there, the next I woke up on my floor. She didn't dismiss me or laugh it off. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand on mine, her touch warm and reassuring. I believe you, she said softly. It sounds insane, but I can see that it's really affecting you. We need to figure out what's going on. A wave of gratitude washed over me, and I found myself looking into her eyes, seeing something there that I hadn't noticed before. Concern, yes, but also a depth of emotion that mirrored my own. For a moment, the fear receded, replaced by something else entirely. Thank you, I murmured, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. You're the only person I could talk to about this. We'll figure it out together, she assured me, her determination clear. But first, we need to find out what the superintendent knows. He was acting strange when you talked to him, right? Like he was hiding something? I nodded, recalling the unease in the man's eyes, the way he had seemed too careful with his words. Yeah, I'm sure he knows more than he's letting on. But I don't think he'll talk easily. Rachel's eyes lit up with a mischievous glint. I have an idea. Let's confront him, but I'll pretend that we're just interested in the history of the building. Maybe we can catch him off guard, make him slip up. I wasn't sure it would work, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. Okay, I agreed. But let's be careful. I have a bad feeling about him. Later that afternoon, we made our way back to the apartment building. The familiar weight of dread settled over me as we entered the lobby, but Rachel's presence was a comfort. We found the superintendent in his small office, a cluttered room filled with old paperwork and faded photographs of the building from decades past. Rachel took the lead, her tone casual as she struck up a conversation. We were talking earlier about the history of this place, she said, flashing the superintendent a friendly smile. It's such an interesting building. I bet it has some great stories. The man's expression remained guarded, but he nodded. It's been around for a long time, he replied, his tone flat. Seen a lot of things. Rachel pressed on, her voice light. I can only imagine. Did you grow up around here? The question seemed innocent enough, but I noticed the flicker of something in his eyes, a brief flash of discomfort. He shifted in his chair, glancing at the papers on his desk as if searching for a way out of the conversation. I've lived here a long time, he said finally. Took over the building after my father passed. It's been in the family for generations. There it was, a sliver of truth slipping through his guarded facade. I exchanged a quick glance with Rachel, who picked up on it immediately. That's fascinating, she said smoothly. It must have been quite something, growing up here. So many rooms, so many secrets. The superintendent's jaw tightened, his discomfort now palpable. It's just an old building, he muttered. Nothing special about it. Sensing that the conversation was veering into dangerous territory, Rachel pivoted. "You wouldn't happen to have any old documents or floor plans, would you? We're curious about the original layout." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, I thought he might refuse. But then he stood, moving to a filing cabinet in the corner. "I have some old blueprints," he said curtly, "but they're not much to look at." He pulled out a dusty folder and handed it to Rachel. As she flipped through the yellowed pages, something caught her eye. "This is interesting," she murmured, her tone casual. "Looks like there used to be more apartments on this floor." The superintendent's reaction was immediate and intense, far more than the situation warranted. He snatched the papers from her hands, his face flushed with anger. "That's enough," he snapped, his voice shaking. "I don't know what you're playing at, but you need to leave." Rachel and I exchanged a startled glance, but before we could respond, he practically shoved us out of the office, slamming the door behind us. The echo of it reverberated through the hallway, leaving us standing there in stunned silence. "What the hell was that about?" I whispered, my heart racing. "I don't know," Rachel admitted, her brow furrowed in confusion. "But whatever it is, he's definitely hiding something." "Did you see how angry he got?" I nodded, still shaken by the man's sudden outburst. It was like he was terrified we'd find something out. Rachel glanced around the hallway, her eyes narrowing. "We need to look at those documents again. He said his family owned the building, right? There must be something in there about them." We hurried back to the superintendent's office, the door now locked. But Rachel wasn't deterred. She led me to the small storage room where she had noticed an unlocked drawer earlier. There, among the stacks of old documents and keys, she found what we were looking for, a dusty old folder labeled with the superintendent's family name. Inside were a few old photographs and documents, but what stood out most was a faded deed showing that the superintendent's family had lived in the very apartment I now occupied. Rachel's face paled as she looked at me, the implications sinking in. "They lived in your apartment," she whispered. "That's why he's so defensive." Before I could process what this meant, a chill ran down my spine. The air around us seemed to shift, growing colder, heavier. Something was wrong. "We need to get out of here," I urged, but as we turned to leave, a low creak echoed down the hallway, a sound that made my blood run cold. We rushed back to my apartment, and as soon as I opened the door, my heart dropped. The passage to the red room was open again, the door slightly ajar, the deep crimson glow spilling out into the darkened apartment. "It's open," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's waiting for us." Rachel squeezed my hand, her own fear evident in her eyes. "Then we go in together," she said firmly. "Whatever is in there, we'll face it. Together." I nodded, trying to summon the courage I didn't feel. We had come too far to turn back now. But as we stepped toward the ominous doorway, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to step into something far darker than either of us could imagine. As Rachel and I stepped through the threshold of the red room, the first thing we noticed was that everything had changed. Gone was the unsettling emptiness, replaced by a bizarre sense of familiarity that gnawed at the edges of my mind. The crimson hue that once dominated the space had softened into the muted tones of an old, neglected bedroom, its furnishings worn and faded, like something out of a long-forgotten past. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of aged wood and mildew filled my nostrils. Rachel and I exchanged uneasy glances, our breaths shallow as we took in our surroundings. The room was cluttered with relics of another time, an old wooden bed with a threadbare quilt, a toy chest adorned with peeling stickers, and a small desk piled high with yellowed papers. It was like stepping into a museum exhibit frozen in time. Rachel moved toward the desk, her fingers brushing over a faded photograph lying atop the papers. "This place, it feels like we've walked into a different era," she murmured, her voice tinged with awe and fear. I nodded, my gaze drawn to the window on the far side of the room. The curtains were thick, heavy with dust, and as I pulled them aside, I was greeted by an unsettling sight. The world outside was no longer the familiar cityscape of my neighborhood. Instead, the view was of a quaint street lined with old cars, the kind you'd see in black and white photos from decades ago. "Rachel," I whispered, my voice tight with panic. "This isn't just a room. We're somewhere else." She joined me at the window, her eyes widening as she took in the scene outside. "Did we cross some kind of time rift?" she asked, her voice trembling as she struggled to make sense of it. "This doesn't make any sense, but it's like we've been transported back in time." Before I could respond, a faint sound caught our attention, a voice, muffled and distant, coming from just beyond the door. My heart raced as I motioned for Rachel to stay quiet, and we both crept closer to the door, peering through the narrow crack where it stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, we saw him, the superintendent, but younger, his hair darker and his face free of the lines that had etched themselves into his features over the years. He was in the hallway, pacing back and forth, speaking in hushed tones to someone we couldn't see. My mind reeled as I tried to comprehend what I was seeing. This was impossible, yet there he was, as real as the air I was struggling to breathe. Rachel's grip on my arm tightened, her eyes wide with disbelief. "That's him, but how is this possible?" Before we could process the implications, the door behind us creaked open, and we both spun around to find a woman standing in the doorway, a woman who could only be the superintendent's wife. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock as she took in the sight of us, two strangers dressed in clothes that didn't belong to this time. Her reaction was immediate. "John," she screamed, her voice piercing the silence. "John, there are intruders in Tommy's room." The younger version of the superintendent, John, rushed into the room, his expression darkening with rage as he laid eyes on us. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling with anger. "What are you doing in my son's room?" "We're not here to hurt anyone," Rachel cried out, raising her hands in a placating gesture. "We're just—" But John wasn't listening. He lunged at us, his face twisted with fury as he grabbed me by the collar, shoving me against the wall with a force that knocked the breath out of me. Panic surged through me as his hands tightened around my throat, cutting off my air supply. I struggled against his grip, but he was impossibly strong, his face inches from mine, his eyes filled with a terrifying intensity. Rachel screamed, desperately trying to pry him off me, but it was no use. The world began to blur around the edges as my vision darkened, and I could feel myself slipping away, the edges of consciousness fraying. Then, in a desperate move, Rachel grabbed a nearby object, a small, heavy statue from the desk, and slammed it into John's face. He let out a howl of pain as the sharp edge caught him in the eye, blood spurting from the wound. His grip on me loosened, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. "Run!" Rachel shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the door. We didn't look back as we bolted out of the room, the sounds of John's enraged screams echoing behind us. We tore down the hallway, our footsteps pounding against the old wooden floors as we raced for the front door. But as we burst through it, expecting to find ourselves back in the dusty hallway of the past, we were met with the familiar sight of my apartment's modern corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the faint hum of the city outside reaching our ears, a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the time-worn room we had just fled. We skidded to a halt, our hearts pounding, as we realized what had happened. Somehow, in our frantic escape, we had returned to the present, back to the safety of the modern world. But as we stood there, panting and trembling, the full weight of our discovery began to sink in. The Red Room wasn't just a hidden space, it was a portal, a doorway to another time, another reality. Rachel was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just a room, is it? It's some kind of time machine. But not just for time, it's like we were in a different version of this world." I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "It's like we stepped into another reality. One where his family never left." Rachel's expression was a mix of fear and determination. "We need to figure out what this is, and why it's here. But one thing's for sure, we can't let anyone else find out about it." I agreed, but as we stood there in the hallway, the implications of what we had just experienced weighed heavily on us. The Red Room was more than a curiosity, it was a dangerous enigma, and we were now entangled in its dark secrets. There was no going back now. As we silently agreed to continue, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The tension in the air was palpable as Rachel and I stood in my apartment, staring at the wall where the entrance to the Red Room had been just moments ago. The door was gone, sealed off as though it had never existed, leaving us with more questions than answers. "We need to understand how this works," I muttered, running my hands through my hair in frustration. "There has to be a way to control it, to figure out when and how the door appears." Rachel paced back and forth, her mind racing as she pieced together the events that had unfolded. "There's something about that room," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Something that's connected to this apartment, to the past, and maybe to the present, too." She paused, her eyes narrowing as she recalled something from our terrifying encounter. During the confrontation, when we were in the room, the one that looked like a child's bedroom, I noticed something. There was a small, hidden space, almost like a closet or a wardrobe. But in the reality we're in now, that space doesn't exist. I looked at her, puzzled. "A hidden space? What are you talking about?" She nodded, moving toward the wall where the Red Room's door had been. There was a section of the wall, behind the bed. It didn't look like much, but it was there. "I think that's where the entrance is. We need to check behind the wall here, in this reality." Her logic was sound, and it gave us a tangible lead to follow. Without wasting another moment, we grabbed a few tools and began to carefully pry away at the wall. It took some effort, but eventually we revealed a narrow opening, a hidden compartment that had been sealed off for who knows how long. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the small space was crammed with old newspapers and documents, their edges yellowed with age. Rachel pulled them out carefully, her eyes widening as she recognized the significance of what we had just uncovered. "These are old newspapers, from decades ago," she whispered, holding up a brittle, crumbling edition of the local paper. The headline was bold and ominous: "The Red Cloak Killer strikes again, another family vanishes without a trace." My heart skipped a beat as I read over her shoulder. The Red Cloak Killer was a name I'd only heard in passing, a ghost story from the city's past. He was a figure of nightmares, a murderer who had terrorized the city long ago but had never been caught. His victims had disappeared without a trace, leaving only fear and speculation in their wake. But as we sifted through the pile, we found something even more disturbing. Among the newspapers was a faded photograph of a family, a woman, 2 children, and a man with a stern expression and dark hair. Rachel gasped as she pointed at the man in the picture. "That's him," she said, her voice shaking. "That's the superintendent. But this photo, it's from years ago." I stared at the photo in disbelief. The man in the picture was unmistakably the superintendent, but he looked much younger. My gaze then shifted to another headline: "Local family disappears, suspected victims of the Red Cloak Killer." The accompanying photograph was the same family we had just seen, listed as missing. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The man in the photo had a scar over his left eye, an injury I remembered vividly from our encounter in the Red Room. But the superintendent we knew in the present didn't have a scar. He was perfectly fine, with both eyes intact. "Rachel, this can't be possible," I whispered, my voice filled with dread. "You didn't hurt the current superintendent. You hurt someone else. Someone from a different reality." Rachel's face paled as the implications of our discovery sank in. "We're not just dealing with time travel," she said, her voice trembling. "We've crossed into another version of this world. One where the Red Cloak Killer is real and his victims are still out there." Before we could process the enormity of what we had just uncovered, a sudden, heavy knock echoed through the apartment, shattering the silence. Rachel and I froze, our eyes locking in fear. The knock came again, more insistent this time, as if whoever was on the other side of the door was demanding to be let in. I motioned for Rachel to stay back as I cautiously approached the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the handle, pulling it open just enough to see who was outside. My blood turned to ice when I saw him standing there. It was the superintendent, but not as I had seen him before. His face was older, more worn, and over his left eye, there was a black patch, a makeshift covering for a wound that hadn't yet healed. He stood there, silent and foreboding, his presence filling the doorway with an almost palpable darkness. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. We weren't back in our reality. We were still in the other one, the one where the Red Cloak Killer had never been caught, where his victims remained lost in time, and where the superintendent was still haunted by the ghosts of his past. Rachel stepped up beside me, her voice barely a whisper. "We didn't come back," she said, her words heavy with the weight of our predicament. "We're still in his world. We've just moved forward in time." The superintendent's single, piercing eye bored into us, and I could feel the unspoken threat lingering in the air. We were trapped, caught in the web of a dark reality that we didn't understand. And as the superintendent's lips curled into a knowing smile, I realized that whatever was happening here, it was far from over. We had opened a door that was never meant to be opened, and now we would have to face the consequences. The air in the room was thick with tension, each breath I took feeling like it was my last. The superintendent stood before us, his single eye blazing with a mix of fury and satisfaction. His presence was terrifying, but the weight of the revelations he was about to drop on us was even more suffocating. "You," he began, his voice low and menacing, "are the reason I've waited all these years. The reason I've kept myself hidden in the shadows, biding my time. And now, my vengeance is within reach." Rachel and I exchanged a quick, panicked glance. We had thought we were uncovering secrets, but we had no idea we were about to unleash something far darker. The superintendent stepped closer, his gaze fixated on the bandage covering his injured eye. "You see, it wasn't just the physical wound that changed me. No, it was much deeper than that. When you struck me, Rachel, you awakened something inside me, something that had been dormant for decades. The Red Cloak Killer." My blood ran cold at the mention of the infamous name. The newspapers had painted him as a monster, a faceless figure of terror who had once terrorized this city. And now, the man standing before us was claiming to be that very monster. "You think you know the story," the superintendent continued, his voice growing more intense, "but you don't. My family, they were everything to me. But they discovered my secret, my dark side. They found out what I had done, who I had become. And in that moment, I lost control. The rage, the bloodlust, it took over, and I became him. I became the Red Cloak Killer." Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. I could barely process what I was hearing. This man, this quiet, unassuming superintendent, was confessing to being one of the most notorious killers in the city's history. I didn't want to kill them, he continued, his voice breaking with the weight of his confession. But once the killer was unleashed, there was no stopping him. My family, they were gone in an instant. And I was left alone, consumed by guilt and hatred for what I had become. His voice grew darker, more sinister, as he recounted the events that followed. I spent years trying to suppress the killer inside me, trying to forget the horrors I had committed. But then, one night, I discovered the Red Room. That room, that cursed space, it showed me things no man should ever see. And it gave me something, a stone, glowing with a dark energy. When I touched it, the entity appeared. Rachel's eyes widened. The entity. He nodded, his expression grim. Yes, the entity. It was a shadow, a manifestation of pure evil. It told me that I could control the killer within, that I could keep him at bay. But there was a price. I had to protect the Red Room, to keep its secrets safe from the world. And in return, I would be granted my ultimate revenge. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything. Revenge? Against who? The superintendent's smile was cold and cruel. Against you. You and Rachel, the ones responsible for reigniting the rage within me. The ones who hurt me, who brought the killer back. The entity told me that this day would come, that I would find the ones who started it all, and that I would finally be free to complete my cycle of vengeance. Rachel's voice was barely a whisper as she spoke. You're going to kill us, just like you killed your family. He didn't respond immediately, but instead reached into his coat and slowly pulled out something that made my heart stop, a long, red cloak, tattered and stained with age. It was the very symbol of the killer he claimed to be. Yes, he said finally, draping the cloak over his shoulders. Tonight, I will end this. I will fulfill my destiny as the Red Cloak Killer one last time. And when I do, I will finally be at peace. We stood there, paralyzed by fear and disbelief, as he prepared to carry out his twisted plan. The cloak billowed around him like a shroud of death, and his eye burned with a murderous intent that left no room for doubt. This was the end. The final act in a tragedy that had begun long before we ever set foot in this cursed building. But as he reached for the knife strapped to his belt, something inside me snapped. I couldn't let this happen, not to Rachel, not to myself. We had to fight back, to stop him before it was too late. The superintendent, now fully transformed into the Red Cloak Killer, took a step toward us, his weapon glinting in the dim light. It's time, he said, his voice a chilling whisper. Time to finish what I started all those years ago. As the reality of our situation set in, I knew that if we didn't act now, we would never get another chance. This was our moment, our only chance to survive. And we weren't going down without a fight. The air was thick with tension, the cold grip of fear tightening around us as we faced the horror of the Red Cloak Killer. His knife gleamed under the dim light of the apartment, and with a swift motion, he lunged at us. In the chaos, Rachel screamed as the blade sliced across her leg, sending a sharp pain through her body. She collapsed, clutching her wound as blood began to pool around her. Rachel! I shouted, rushing to her side. Her blood, dark and ominous, seeped through the cracks in the wooden floor. As the liquid disappeared between the floorboards, a low, eerie rumble echoed through the room. The ground beneath us began to tremble, and with a loud creak, the passage to the Red Room opened once again. The killer, momentarily distracted by the opening, turned his head toward the emerging passage. Seizing the opportunity, I tackled him to the ground, the two of us struggling violently. I managed to knock the knife from his grasp, sending it skittering across the floor. With a burst of adrenaline, I pushed him back, giving Rachel just enough time to crawl toward the passage. "Come on, we need to go," she gasped, her voice strained with pain. We scrambled toward the red room, the killer regaining his footing and following close behind. The door slammed shut behind us, leaving us in the cold, dark chamber once again. The stone in the center of the room, the source of all this madness, still glowed with that eerie, unsettling light. "We have to destroy it," I said, my voice trembling. "This is where it all started, and this is where it has to end." Rachel nodded weakly, her face pale from the blood loss. "The entity, we need to call it," she whispered, desperation in her eyes. "It's the only way." With no other options, we began to shout, calling out to the darkness, demanding the entity's presence. The room grew colder, the shadows deepening as the air thickened around us. Suddenly, the glow from the stone faded, and the entity materialized before us, a towering figure of shadow and malice. Rachel, clutching her bleeding leg, crawled toward the stone. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes meeting mine. We both knew this was our last chance. As she reached out, her bloodied hand grasped the stone, and an intense energy surged through the room. The entity roared, its form distorting as it realized what was happening. "The blood, it can destroy it," Rachel gasped, her voice trembling. "We have to do this, now." Just as the killer burst into the room, his eyes wild with fury, Rachel looked at me with a fierce determination. There was no turning back now. We had to end this once and for all. With all her strength, Rachel squeezed the stone, her blood mixing with its cold surface. The entity howled, a deafening sound that rattled the very walls of the red room. The killer lunged toward us, but it was too late. The stone cracked, its surface shattering as a blinding light erupted from within. A vortex of unimaginable force opened up, sucking everything into its endless void. The killer screamed as he was dragged toward it, his body twisting and contorting as he fought against the pull. The entity's form disintegrated, swallowed by the vortex along with the remains of the red room. The force was overwhelming, pulling us closer to the void. Then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor of my apartment. The familiar surroundings of the living room greeted me, the eerie silence replaced by the mundane sounds of the city outside. Rachel was next to me, her leg miraculously healed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. We were safe. We were home. "Are you okay?" I whispered, pulling her into a tight embrace. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We did it. We destroyed it." In the heat of the moment, relief and adrenaline took over, and we kissed, the intensity of our shared ordeal washing over us like a wave. When we finally pulled away, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't stay here. Not after everything." Rachel agreed, and we quickly gathered what little we needed, leaving the rest behind. There was no point in holding on to anything from that cursed place. As we walked to the door, I felt a sense of finality, a desperate need to put this nightmare behind us. When we reached the lobby, I handed the keys to the superintendent. He looked at me with a neutral expression, his eyes seemingly normal, devoid of the madness we had seen before. But as I turned to leave, Rachel tugged at my arm, her face pale. "Look," she whispered, her voice shaking. I turned back just in time to see the superintendent smile, a slow, knowing grin spreading across his face. Draped over his arm was a tattered, red cloak. My heart skipped a beat as I realized the terrifying truth. We had escaped the nightmare, but the man standing before us was not the one we had known. Or perhaps he was exactly who we feared he might be. Hand in hand, Rachel and I walked out of the building, the weight of our experience heavy on our shoulders. As we stepped into the daylight, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. The superintendent stood in the doorway, watching us with that unsettling smile, the red cloak clutched tightly in his hand. We had survived, but the horrors of the Red Room and the twisted reality it had revealed would haunt us forever.
If you want to watch another story, there is another video appearing on your screen now. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spine-chilling stories.